The Eastern Front in World War II was the largest and deadliest theatre of war, fought from June 22, 1941 to May 9, 1945, primarily between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union alongside their respective allies. It played a decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Axis powers in Europe and involved immense brutality, destruction and loss of life. Millions lost for the Soviets and Axis, including civilians and soldiers alike. The front stretched across central, eastern and parts of northern and southeastern Europe, witnessing some of the largest and bloodiest battles in history, such as Stalingrad, Kursk and the Siege of Leningrad. The Axis, led by Germany, launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, invading the Soviet Union without a formal declaration of war. Despite some early successes and deep advances toward Moscow, the Axis failed in their objective to decisively defeat the Soviet Union, largely due to overstretched supply lines, fierce Soviet resistance, and the harsh Russian winter. After the pivotal Soviet victory at Stalingrad in early 1943, German offensive capabilities were permanently crippled, and the Red Army began a sustained counter-offensive that pushed Axis forces steadily westward, eventually reaching Berlin in 1945. The Axis coalition on the Eastern Front included not only Nazi Germany, but also its allies such as Italy, Hungary, Romania, Croatia and Slovakia. Finland also took part against the Soviets, although not officially an Axis partner. While Germany held primary strategic command, many of these allies contributed troops and resources. However, Italy, despite being part of the Axis, had limited involvement on the Eastern Front in comparison to Germany and Romania. The unity of the Axis alliance was often fragile, with divergent strategic interests and the gradual weakening of their collective military capabilities as the war progressed. At the war's start on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was initially unprepared for the German invasion, having been caught off guard despite intelligence warnings. Stalin initially underestimated Hitler's intentions, which led to catastrophic Soviet losses in 1941. However, the USSR rapidly mobilized, relocating vast industrial capacity eastward, adopting a scorched earth policy, and imposing ruthless discipline and sacrifice on both its military and civilian populations. The Soviet government, under Stalin's leadership, centralized war efforts and became a formidable war machine, eventually turning the tide with massive battles like Stalingrad and Kursk. The USSR was also supported materially by the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease. Italy's involvement on the Eastern Front was comparatively limited and less impactful than Germany's. Italian forces were sent mainly as part of the Italian army in Russia. These forces fought alongside Axis powers, primarily in southern Russia and Ukraine, but suffered heavy losses, especially during the Soviet winter counter-offensive in 1942-43. Italy's military on the Eastern Front struggled with equipment inadequacies and harsh conditions. Political and military setbacks on the Eastern Front, combined with losses in North Africa and internal dissent, contributed to Italy's weakening position within the Axis, culminating in its surrender and switch to the Allied side in 1943. It was Italy under Mussolini's leadership that hampered Hitler's attempt to invade the USSR early on in the war. Italy's aggression against Greece, ordered by Benito Mussolini, was a significant episode in World War II that had strategic consequences far beyond the immediate conflict. Mussolini, driven by ambition to establish Italy as a dominant power in the Mediterranean and to gain prestige as the junior partner in the Axis alliance, launched the invasion of Greece on October 28, 1940, from Italian-controlled Albania. This invasion was intended to be a swift victory, boosting Italian morale and demonstrating Italy's strength. Mussolini's arrogance would have consequences, as the poorly prepared Italian forces met unexpectedly strong Greek resistance, leading to a protracted and costly campaign. Mussolini's initial confidence was undermined as the Greek army not only halted the Italian advance, but counterattacked, pushing Italian troops back into Albania. This was the first major Axis setback during the war. The Italians' forces were very badly prepared and disorganised, similar to their start in the North African campaign. An Italian general, Quirino Amelini, noted in his diary during deployment, "The disorder, lack of preparation, and muddle in every sphere. Someone will say, 15 days we must be ready to march against Yugoslavia, or in 8 days we'll attack Greece from Albania, as easily as saying, let's have a cup of coffee. The Duce hasn't the least idea of the differences between preparing war on flat terrain or in mountains, in summer or in winter. Still less does he worry about the fact that we lack weapons, ammunition, equipment, animals, raw materials." The conflict in Greece strained Italian military resources and morale, exposing Italy's weaknesses. The failure forced Germany to divert its forces to assist Italy and secure the Balkans, thereby delaying Hitler's original timetable for the invasion of the Soviet Union. German troops had to intervene in April 1941 to invade Greece from Bulgaria and clear British forces that had come to aid the Greeks, which postponed the Soviet campaign and impacted the overall course of the war. This diversion of German forces was critical. The delay of Operation Barbarossa, which began in June 1941 instead of earlier, meant German troops encountered the severe Russian winter, for which they were unprepared, contributing to their ultimate failure on the Eastern Front. The Greek campaign thus indirectly altered the strategic landscape, highlighting how Mussolini's aggressive move in the Balkans forced Germany into a reactive position, impacting the largest theatre of the war. Mussolini's motivations for invading Greece was in part to try and flex his muscles as the war began for the Italians. Seeing that progression had been made by Hitler with his early invasions of France and Poland, he had to show that he was on an equilibrium with the German fascist leader. Hitler had already been summoned by another newly pro-fascist regime, Romania. Romania needed assistance and called for German troops to protect the country from the Soviets. Mussolini, perturbed by this, and the fact that the Romanians did not ask for Italy's assistance, drove the decision to invade Greece. Benito Mussolini's ambitions for Italy in World War II, including the Eastern Front, were deeply rooted in his fascist ideology and desire to restore Italy to the status of a great imperial power. Mussolini envisioned Italy as the dominant Mediterranean power, with significant influence over the Balkans, North Africa, and the broader European arena. His foreign policy aimed at territorial expansion, known as Spazio Vitale, and restoring Italy to the greatness reminiscent of the Roman Empire. This ambition drove Mussolini to align with Nazi Germany, as he believed an alliance with Hitler would help Italy secure its claims and expand its influence both in Europe and beyond. Mussolini's fascist ideology emphasised aggressive nationalism, militarism, and the glorification of the state. The fascist regime sought to unite Italians under a spirit of martial valour and territorial conquest, promoting the idea of Italy as a rejuvenated empire destined to lead in Europe. This mindset pushed Mussolini toward interventionist policies, including the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and Albania in 1939, and the entry into World War II, mostly motivated by opportunism and a desire not to be sidelined by German successors. Despite Italy's military and economic weaknesses, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France in June 1940, motivated by the belief that a short war would bring Italy territorial gains without major sacrifices. This decision reflected Mussolini's ideological goal of expansion, but underestimated Italy's actual readiness and the scale of the coming conflict. Mussolini envisioned a new Roman Empire that would extend Italy's control across the Mediterranean and beyond, often referring to the Mediterranean Sea as Mare Nostrum, our sea, a historical term used by ancient Rome to denote domination over the Mediterranean basin. Mussolini's foreign policy was shaped by this vision of recreating an empire stretching from the Straits of Gibraltar in the west to the Strait of Hormuz in the east. He sought control over the Balkans, North Africa, and parts of the Mediterranean to give Italy strategic dominance over vital sea routes and territories. He believed Italy was confined and weakened by British and French control of key Mediterranean bases such as Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, and Suez, which he famously described as the bars of the prison that held Italy captive. Mussolini's ambition was to break this Mediterranean prison and secure unrestricted access to the world's oceans. Mussolini was deeply motivated by the desire to prove Italy's strength on the international stage, showcase Italian military prowess, and ensure Italy was counted among the victors reshaping Europe. The perceived mutilated victory after World War I, when Italy felt it did not gain all it was promised in the Treaty of London, fueled his determination to secure Italy's dominance and rightful place among great powers. Mussolini sought military glory and territorial expansion as means to unify Italians under fascism, boost national pride, and elevate Italy's status to that of a major world empire alongside Germany and Japan. This desire led Italy into a series of aggressive campaigns before and during World War II, the invasion of Ethiopia, the annexation of Albania, the intervention in the Spanish Civil War, and eventually engagements in the Balkans and North Africa. Despite Italy's limited economic and military capacity, Mussolini was determined to not be sidelined and to be part of the table of victors, hoping Italy would command influence and reap rewards from Axis successes. The alliance with Nazi Germany through the Pact of Steel was also part of this strategy to secure Italy's place as a key player in the new imperial order Mussolini wanted to build. Mussolini decided to commit Italian forces to the Eastern Front in 1941, shortly before Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union. On the day the invasion occurred, Mussolini announced Italy's participation in the campaign. The goal was to cement Italy's status as a major Axis power and gain a share in the spoils of the expected German victory against the USSR. An expeditionary force named the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, Corpo di Spedizione Italiano in Russia, CSIR, consisting of 3 divisions, was quickly mobilised and arrived on the Eastern Front by mid-July 1941. Initially, the CSIR was integrated into the German 11th Army and later the 1st Panzer Army. As the battle on the Eastern Front intensified, demands for reinforcements grew. By April 1942, Mussolini sent 2 additional corps to join the CSIR. All combined forces were reorganised into the 8th Italian Army, also known as the Armata Italiana in Russia, abbreviated to Armia. The Armia was deployed in the southern sector of the front around the Don River, tasked with covering the left flank of the German advance towards Stalingrad. Italian troops participated in several operations against Soviet forces, but were repeatedly overwhelmed, especially during the winter. The Soviet counter-offensive after the German defeat at Stalingrad in late 1942 and early 1943 heavily impacted Italian positions. On December 16, 1942, a major Soviet offensive overran parts of the Italian 8th Army. Italian divisions suffered heavy casualties and were forced into a disorderly retreat over January 1943. By the end of January, surviving forces were regrouped or evacuated. The retreat and evacuation of Italian forces concluded by March 1943, marking the end of major Italian military operations on the Eastern Front. The Italian effort had been costly, marked by logistical challenges, inadequate equipment for the harsh winter, and being overwhelmed by the scale of the Soviet counter-offensive. The CSIR was Italy's initial military contribution to the Eastern Front during World War II, formed by Benito Mussolini in July 1941 to demonstrate solidarity with Nazi Germany following Operation Barbarossa. The CSIR was a corps-sized unit comprising about 62,000 troops, organised into 3 divisions. These were the 9th Infantry Division Pasubio, the 52nd Infantry Division Torino, and the 3rd Cellera Division Principe Amadeo Duca d'Aosta, a mobile division with cavalry, light tanks and motorised infantry. The corps also included artillery, limited armoured support, and an aviation command from the Italian Royal Air Force, Regia Aeronautica. The formation of the CSIR was officially ordered on July 10, 1941. Despite initial German hesitation, the Italian forces arrived in southern Russia between July and August 1941 and subordinated initially to the German 11th Army under General Eugene Ritter von Schobert, later moving under the command of Panzer Group 1 and eventually the 1st Panzer Army. The CSIR fought primarily in Ukraine, successfully engaging Soviet forces in battles such as the Battle of Petrikavka and the capture of key industrial cities like Stalino, now Donetsk, and Golovka. Their early operations were considered relatively effective, with coordinated advances and notable local victories, such as the encirclement at Petrokalka, capturing over 10,000 Soviet prisoners. Despite some tactical successes, the CSIR was hindered by limited mechanisation, only partially motorised, and outdated equipment, including light tankettes that were less effective on the Eastern Front. The 3rd Chelera Division, intended for fast reconnaissance, had limited effectiveness when facing heavier Soviet armour and tough winter conditions. Cooperation with German commands presented challenges due to doctrinal differences and equipment limitations. By mid-1942, Mussolini sought to expand Italy's presence on the Eastern Front significantly. In July 1942, the CSIR was incorporated into the much larger Italian army in Russia, Armata Italiana in Russia, Armée, also known as the 8th Italian Army. The Armée grew to include additional corps and divisions that further increased the Italian troop count to approximately 235,000 soldiers. The Armée was tasked with defending a sector along the Don River, protecting the left flank of the German 6th Army as it advanced toward Stalingrad. The CSIR itself became the 35th Army Corps within the Armée structure, continued to operate under German overall command, but now as part of a broader Italian military formation supporting Germany's southern offensive. General Giovanni Messe and General Italo Garibaldi were the two primary commanders who led Italy's military efforts on the Eastern Front, Messe commanding first the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, CSIR, and later Garibaldi would command the expanded Italian army in Russia, Armée. Messe was appointed commander of the CSIR on July 14, 1941, a highly respected and experienced officer. He had previously commanded Italian formations during the Greco Italian War, where he demonstrated competence and a pragmatic approach. Messe was chosen for this command because of his military skill and experience in mechanised and mobile warfare, a crucial qualification for leading Italy's motorised expeditionary force intended to support Germany's advance into the Soviet Union. Under Messe, the CSIR operated from mid-July 1941 to April 1942, engaging in successful, though limited, combat efforts in southern Ukraine. He was notable for reporting to Mussolini and German command about his troops' inadequate supplies, lack of proper anti-tank weapons, and the difficulties faced in the harsh Eastern Front environment. Messe was frustrated with German misunderstandings of Italian operational capabilities and logistical problems. He managed to maintain reasonable combat effectiveness despite these challenges. Messe's leadership ended in July 1942 when the Italian Expeditionary Corps was restructured and expanded into the Armée. At that time, General Italo Garibaldi took over command. Messe left Russia in November 1942, later receiving other important commands, including the Italo-German Tank Army in North Africa. The CSIR became one of the three army corps forming Armée, and Messe's replacement for command was General Francesco Zingales. Garibaldi assumed command of the Armée in July 1942. This appointment came as the Italian presence on the Eastern Front was significantly expanded. Garibaldi was responsible for overseeing the larger and more complex operation tasked with guarding the left flank of the German forces advancing toward Stalingrad. His period of command witnessed some of the hardest fighting and the most significant setbacks for Italian forces on the Eastern Front. During the Soviet winter counter-offensive that began in December 1942, the Armée was heavily engaged and suffered devastating losses. Despite efforts to maintain defensive positions, Italian units were overwhelmed by better equipped Soviet forces and forced into a chaotic retreat. Garibaldi remained in command until the final withdrawal of Italian forces in early 1943. His leadership period marked the transformation of Italy's Eastern Front campaign from initial aggressive participation to a defensive and retreating posture in the face of overwhelming Soviet offensives. The Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, Corpo di Spedizione Italiano in Russia, CSIR, and the later expanded Italian Army in Russia, Armata Italiana in Russia, Armée, had detailed and structured orders of battle comprising infantry divisions, mobile divisions, armoured formations, supporting artillery and other units. The CSIR was formed mainly to provide a somewhat mobile force tailored for the Eastern Front's demands. It consisted of around 62,000 troops in 3 main divisions. 9th Infantry Division Pasubio, one of Italy's better trained and equipped divisions. It included 2 infantry regiments, a motorised artillery regiment with 100mm and 75mm guns, augmented by mortar battalions and anti-tank companies. The 52nd Infantry Division Torino, also a motorised infantry division with a similar structure to Pasubio, known for its competence and support units, including artillery and anti-tank components. The 3rd Cavalieri Division, Principe Amadeo Duca d'Aosta, combining cavalry, notably the Savoia Cavalleria and Lancieri di Navarra regiments, also the elite fighting infantry Bersaglieri and some lightly mechanised units. This division included light armoured tankettes like the L335, but only about 40 operational out of 60 sent, which were inadequate against Soviet tanks. The division also received a small number of L640 tanks before the CSIR was reorganised into the Armee. The Cavalieri Division had relatively weaker artillery support compared to the infantry divisions. The CSIR had a limited aviation component known as the Expeditionary Air Corps in Russia, Corpo Aereo Spedizioni in Russia, part of the Regia Aeronautica, with fighters, bombers and transport aircraft. The Regia Aeronautica contributed a dedicated expeditionary air corps to support Italian ground forces on the Eastern Front in Russia. This contingent operated under the CSIR Aviation Command and was tasked with reconnaissance, air superiority and transport missions. The commander of this formation was Colonel Carlo Drago. The following aircraft made up the Italian Air Corps: the Macchi C-200 Saetta, used for air superiority and escort duties, part of fighter group squadrons; the Caproni CA-311, used for reconnaissance and observation. Around August 1942, the fighter squadrons were boosted with the arrival of the Macchi C-202 Folgori, along with more C-200 Saettas. There were medium bomber planes sent to the Eastern Front, although it would have carried out reconnaissance duties too. The Fiat BR-20 Cicogna, which used incendiary bombs mostly to drop on enemy infantry positions rather than tanks. The Caproni CA-311 was classified as a light bomber reconnaissance aircraft and was capable of carrying and dropping bombs in combat operations. While it primarily performed observation and reconnaissance roles, it could be equipped with bombs for close support missions. The lack of bombers and ground attack planes further limited the close support for the Italians that might have played a bigger part in disrupting Soviet armoured formations and advances. However, the Expeditionary Air Corps in Russia did perform relatively well. That leaves only one other supporting unit that could possibly destroy the more modern Soviet tanks. That support comes in the form of artillery. The CSIR initially had about 220 artillery pieces and 92 anti-tank guns as part of its roughly 62,000 men strength. In July 1942, the CSIR was enlarged and restructured into the Armee, also known as the 8th Italian Army. This was a much larger formation comprising approximately 235,000 men, organised into 3 army corps, deployed mainly along the Don River to protect the German 6th Army's flank during the push towards Stalingrad. Key components included the 35th Army Corps, formerly CSIR, containing Pasubio, Torino and the 3rd Cavalieri Division; 2nd Army Corps, comprising several regular infantry divisions, Sforzesca, Ravenna and Coseria. 3 Alpini divisions were sent, forming a 3rd Corps, the Alpini Corps, 2nd Alpini Division, Tridentina, 3rd Alpini Division, Giulia, 4th Alpini Division, Cunenza. The Alpini were mountain troops recognised for their elite training and toughness, but their specialisation was better suited for mountainous warfare, rather than the vast, flat steppe of southern Russia. Despite this, their discipline and resilience were notable during the harsh winter campaigns and in the desperate retreats following Soviet offensives. The Alpini divisions were on par with the Bersaglieri, crack troops and the best at what they do, soldiering. Other infantry divisions included 3 legions of black shirts, these were volunteer soldiers, the 156th Infantry Division Vicenza, under the command of the 8th Army, 2 German divisions and 1 Croatian light transport brigade. Armir tank and armoured units were expanded but still not sufficient against Soviet armour and the conditions on the Eastern Front. The first of the L640 tanks arrived in May 1941 under the CSIR, but further L6 tanks were delivered from 1941 to 1943. The L640 tanks were primarily assigned to the 67th Armoured Bersaglieri Battalion of the 3rd Celeri Division that arrived in the summer of 1942. The battalion was deployed as a fast mobilised unit but severely limited as an armoured force. There were 2 companies formed with 60 tanks between them. The Semaventi L40 to 4732 self-propelled guns were also deployed with the Celeri Division in 1942 as part of Armir. The 8th Self-Propelled Anti-Tank Group, Cavalieri di Alessandria, had 2 squadrons of 19 Semaventi to 4732 assault guns. The vehicle being a light, compact, open-top SPG based on the L640 chassis. The Italian armoured component lacked adequate tanks for the scale and mechanised nature of the Eastern Front. Some tankettes may still have been operational under Armir, as too were armoured cars like the AB-41. No M1340 or M1441 tanks were present, the best tanks that Italy had to offer at the time. Armir included several artillery regiments, engineering units, anti-tank battalions and logistical troops. For anti-tank defence, the Armir had been allocated 278 guns of the 47-32 type, cannoni to 47-32 M35. Artillery included 75mm and 100mm guns. Heavier artillery pieces were scarce and anti-tank weapons and motor transport were insufficient relative to Soviet assets. The Armir had the only existing battery of 210-22 howitzers, Abicida or 210-22, 36 of the 51 available 149-40 guns, cannoni to 149-40 Modello 35, and all 36 modern 75-32 field guns in existence at the time. There were also the 75-18 howitzers used. This provided heavy firepower and balance to the limited combat performance of the 47-32 gun. The artillery would be critical in directing fire at the Soviet Union's more heavily armoured tanks. Supporting units also included the medical services, signals, supply units, as well as the existing Air Corps for close air support. Before I move on to the next segment of this presentation, I just want to share a few thoughts on Italy's situation now I've looked at the order of battle in regards to armour. I'll be saving tactical and battle analysis for other videos, but my initial thoughts are that the CSIR and Armir would have been heavily reliant on artillery against enemy tanks. Aircraft and light tanks or armoured cars would play their part in reconnaissance, I believe, but if the tank crews see T-34s and KV-1s approaching, tanks I'll talk about later, they have to disengage and retreat, get into cover and out of sight, and I would think radioing to command the positions of the enemy tanks. Engaging would put the crews at serious risk. Artillery would have to perform the job of trying to destroy the tanks once positions were known. Perhaps an aircraft ground attack from the Air Corps would assist at times, but maybe not often. The infantry could also perform the role of destroying tanks with anti-tank weaponry. Firstly, anti-tank rifles. These would be Solothurn rifles, otherwise known as the Fucile Anticarro S. I think the Alpini infantry units had some of these, possibly the Bersaglieri as well. The only other possibility is taking out isolated tanks through ambushes where infantry could use anti-tank grenades or improvised grenades. But this really would have to be isolated tanks in urban areas where infantry could remain undetected and waiting for the right moment to attack. The Italian Expeditionary Corps, first deployed on the Eastern Front, immediately found things difficult. There was tension between CSIR Commander General Giovanni Messe and German leadership. The CSIR was expected to operate and function like a German division, Laws had been agreed between Italian and German officials around 1941 to 1942. But it would be a dysfunctional coalition. After Mussolini's unannounced invasion of Greece, Hitler had left the Italians in the dark, and the Italians entered the conflict on the day of the invasion, very late and unprepared, without clear operations. With this in mind, it was agreed between the Comando Supremo, Ugo Cavaliero, and German counterpart Wilhelm Keitel that the CSIR be placed under the command of the German army. The CSIR would be a semi-independent fighting group, but not one that could separate its operations from the Germans, but it was insisted that the CSIR be used for offensive operations. The Germans overestimated the Italians' capabilities in movement and transportation. Although there were infantry units like the Bersaglieri on motorcycles and some infantry units carried in troop transporters, there were many infantry units that were marching on foot or carried on horseback. The Germans misunderstood these limitations, looking at the Italians as a highly mobilised and mechanised force. They did not realise that large parts of the corps was lacking vehicle transportation. General Messer grew in frustration during the early stages of the campaign. Here's a quote from Messer in English: "The insertion of CSIR in the ultra-mobile and manoeuvrable complex of an armoured group demonstrated how the German command persisted in an error of judgment regarding the characteristics of our motorised units, and neglected moreover to account for the already grave difficulties of our logistical situation." The Italian infantry divisions, the 9th Pasubio Division and 52nd Torino Division, were prepared for mechanised warfare, but there were a lack of vehicles to transport the soldiers in these divisions, and organisation could be a problem, as there were fast-moving infantry such as the Bersaglieri on motorcycles, while other units of the Celeri Division, a fast division, couldn't keep pace. During offensive operations, the division didn't always cooperate as a whole, and it was not the best division to be deployed on the Eastern Front, considering the kind of tanks used by the Red Army. This supposedly mobile mechanised division didn't have adequate armour for the campaign. There would be many Italian soldiers forced to go on long marches to keep pace, which was often gruelling and exhausting. This affected the condition of the men and the morale. Nevertheless, there were successful offensive operations early on by the CSIR in Ukraine, the Torino and Pasubio divisions proving themselves in encircling and destroying Soviet units. There wasn't just friction between the German and Italian commanders. The Italian soldiers didn't like the conduct of the Germans at times, witnessing the brutality that their allies would carry out against Soviet civilian populations. The Italians were much more humane in their treatment of Soviet civilians and captured soldiers. It was very much an uneasy coalition all round for the two Axis nations. In late October 1941, still deployed in Ukraine, the CSIR started to experience major logistical problems in the tough extreme weather. Roads became bogged down in mud due to heavy rain, and Italy's infrastructure and logistical supply lines were much like in North Africa, poor. The poor road conditions impeded vehicle movement, and supplies were not arriving from the rear to frontline units. Regiments of infantry reporting a lack of supplies, and in some circumstances losing radio contact because of a lack of batteries for wireless sets. The soldiers' morale dropped even further because the weather impeded the postal service. So often the spirits of soldiers are lifted when hearing from their close ones when on the front lines. This lack of vital communication would have an impact on the men who are experiencing the harshness of the weather. It is fair to say that from then on the Italians would experience many casualties even when objectives were achieved, and some casualties were not victims of the enemy but the weather that got worse and worse as autumn passed and winter arrived. Frostbite would be a big problem for the soldiers. When we think about army supplies, we usually think about ammunition, fuel and water, but in this extreme cold environment, winter clothing would be a major priority. The Italian soldiers were not sufficiently protected against the winter elements, and supplies of winter clothing were failing to arrive because of the poor roads and limited rail capacity. And of course the soldiers were complaining about the lack of luxuries, cigarettes and tobacco to name a few. Food was also becoming scarce, from essentials like pasta, butter and cheese to dried vegetables, sauces and meat. There were problems for the cavalry of the 3rd Celeri Division, men that fought on horseback. The war horses were in danger of starvation, as supplies for animal feed was insufficient. This led to rationing, and the horses were malnourished. One of General Mess's greatest challenges, other than the logistics for his army, would be to maintain the morale of the soldiers. While not one for anger, he was not happy with commanders whinging and complaining about the lack of supplies. He did not want the morale to fall. His soldiers must keep their spirits for the tough ordeal in a campaign they were not prepared or properly equipped for. There were common reports of Italian forces looting local populations on the Eastern Front. Any resources would be taken. The Italian soldiers were in a desperate situation where survival was the priority. What else could they do? The Germans had control of the railway schedules, and the Italians blamed them for the lack of crucial supplies coming from the railroads, with the CSIR not receiving its requested supplies quite often. Later in the campaign, the CSIR expanded, becoming the Armee, and now under the command of General Italo Garibaldi. Part of this new formation included 3 divisions of the Alpini. The Alpini are crack troops, some of the best Italy have, forming a competitive and friendly rivalry with the elite Bersaglieri. Well trained, disciplined and professional, and they specialised in mountainous terrain. The Alpini were originally to operate in the Caucasus Mountains, but due to a lack of transport capacity, in August 1942, the Germans instead assigned them to von Weich's Army Group B, destined for the steppes around Stalingrad. A steppe is large, flat, unforested grasslands. This would demoralise the Alpini, who bemoaned the fact that the armament, the equipment, the entire supply of their materials were not adapted for a war in the plains. They were fit out for the mountains. Another logistical disaster for Italy, deploying troops specialised for a certain terrain only to be fielded in an altogether different terrain they were not suited to. A lot of Italy's transport for both the CSIR and later Armee relied on horse-drawn transport. It was just too slow for modern combat operations across a vast expanse of Ukraine and Russia. This limited their ability to keep up with motorised and mechanised Soviet forces during retreats or rapid counterattacks, and many soldiers would march on foot for long distances. For example, units transferred to the Don often had to go on long marches. Even in the summer on the Eastern Front was torture for these soldiers. Here's an account from an Alpini officer, Pasquale Grinaschi, transferred to the Don. We march, carrying our haversacks, in 2 long files alongside the wide track, almost continuously enveloped by a cloud of dark, thick and heavy dust, raised by the steps of men and mules and by the wheels of German vehicles that, in never-ending columns, flood toward the front. This black dust penetrates the eyes, the nostrils, it clogs the mouth, it sticks to sweaty skin, it forces you to tie a handkerchief over your nose and mouth as if protecting yourself from desert sand during the blow of the Ghibli. The Italians were also reliant on German cooperation for transportation and supply allocation, leading to shortages and prioritisation issues. General Mess's frustrations early on in the campaign is an example that there was a lack of cooperation between the Germans and Italians at times. There were also complaints that the Germans used Italian soldiers and other Axis troops belonging to Hungary and Romania as cannon fodder during key battles such as Stalingrad. Transportation was further hampered due to the wider Russian railway gauge, causing complications in transportation logistics compared to the systems used by Germany and Italy, requiring frequent transfers and modifications. The whole campaign can be summed up as a logistical mess for the Italians and significantly contributed to their eventual defeat and evacuation from the conflict. Italian armour on the Eastern Front was notably limited in both type and quantity, with significant logistical and strategic factors shaping its deployment. Medium tanks such as the M1340 and M1441 were absent from the campaign due to production shortages, logistical constraints and prioritisation of other theatres like North Africa, as well as mainland Italy and the Balkans for defence. The M1340 and M1441 were not sent to Russia primarily because Italian industry could not produce enough vehicles to equip all theatres with modern armour. Logistics played a crucial role, as supplying and maintaining medium tanks across the vast distances and limited infrastructure of the Eastern Front was extremely difficult. There were serious logistics problems that prevented the transportation of Italian medium tanks like the M1340 and M1441 to the Eastern Front. The size and weight, around 14 to 14.5 tons, and mechanical unreliability of these vehicles made them difficult to transport over the long distances required for deployment in Russia. Italian rail infrastructure was less developed for heavy, long-distance armoured vehicle movement compared to Germany, and there was a shortage of suitable rail wagons capable of carrying medium tanks such as the M1340 and M1441 across Europe to the Eastern Front. Transport trucks available to Italian forces were generally underpowered and not designed for towing or carrying medium tanks over poor, war-damaged roads. This made road transport of medium tanks highly challenging, both in Italy and deeper into Soviet territory. The available rail and truck transport was reserved for infantry, supplies and lighter vehicles that could operate with less risk of breakdown and were more versatile in poor terrain. Italian medium tanks, especially the earlier series of M1340 models, were mechanically unreliable and often suffered breakdowns, which would be further exacerbated by difficult terrain and harsh weather conditions typical of the Eastern Front had it been deployed there. Without secure and regular supply lines, maintaining tanks like the M1340 and M1441 far from workshops and repair sites would be considered impractical. Because of these combined problems, Italian armoured forces in Russia relied on smaller, lighter vehicles that could be more easily moved and maintained under the challenging logistical circumstances of the campaign. Italian military leadership also prioritised North Africa and the Balkans, where the Caddo M tanks saw service, rather than the Eastern Front. As a result, only lighter and more mobile vehicles made it to Russia. The Caddo Amato L640 was the primary armoured vehicle in Russia, chosen for its relatively light weight and mobility suited for poor roads and bridges. The Italians' logistical infrastructure could cope with the weight of this vehicle and supply to the Eastern Front. These tanks were typically used in reconnaissance roles and supporting infantry rather than main force assaults. They were all fitted with radios. Their armament, a 20mm autocannon and a coaxial machine gun, proved limited against Soviet armour, but they could engage soft targets and infantry effectively. The Semovente L40-4732 was a self-propelled gun based on the L640 chassis and armed with a 47mm anti-tank gun, another light enough vehicle that could be transported to the Eastern Front. Deployed alongside the L640s, its main task was to provide direct fire support against enemy positions and vehicles. It performed somewhat better than the L640 against Soviet armour due to its main gun, but still struggled against more heavily armoured T-34s and KV series tanks. Italian forces in Russia also used L333 and L335 tankettes. These vehicles were intended for reconnaissance, infantry support and communications, but offered minimal protection and almost no ability to combat Soviet tanks. Their small machine guns were effective only against infantry or unarmoured vehicles. Italian armour faced an extremely tough environment on the Eastern Front. The L640s and Semovente L40-4732s struggled with harsh terrain, severe weather and mechanical unreliability. Often they were bogged down in mud and movement could be slow. Against Soviet armour, their firepower and armour were generally inadequate, resulting in heavy losses and limited tactical successes. Losses in tanks would not be adequately replaced due to Italy's industrial limitations and prioritisation of other theatres. Italian armoured cars, especially the AB-41, were used for reconnaissance and patrol duties in Ukraine and Soviet territories. The AB-41 was well suited for open terrain and road patrols, but was not heavily armoured or armed. These vehicles carried out scouting, communication, supply liaison, and sometimes security in rear areas, helping to compensate for the limited number of tanks in Italian units. The overall impact of Italian armoured vehicles on the Eastern Front was minor, hampered by insufficient numbers, poor reliability, and equipment that was outmatched by Soviet arms and conditions. The Soviet Union's superior armour, consisting of T-34s and KV-1s, meant that it was a bit of a mismatch, with Italy fielding light vehicles with poor armour protection and limited firepower and penetration. The most significant vehicle was the T-34, which overshadowed Italy's own armoured vehicles in both numbers and capability. The T-34 was a medium tank, valued for its powerful 76mm gun sloped armour offering superior protection and impressive mobility. Its design emphasised simplicity and durability, enabling mass production, a critical advantage as the Red Army could field tank forces far larger than their Axis opponents. Italian forces, whose own armour included the L640, Semoventi 4732 and L3 series tankettes, found themselves outclassed by the T-34's firepower, protection and reliability. Even the T-34's speed was no slouch at around 50 to 53 km per hour, with cross-country terrain performance enhanced by the Christie suspension system. The KV-1 was one of the Soviet Union's most formidable heavy tanks during the early years of World War II, and it indeed posed a serious challenge to Italian forces on the Eastern Front due to its heavy armour and armament. The KV-1 was a heavy tank designed for breakthrough and assault roles, weighing approximately 42 to 46 tons depending on the variant. It featured exceptionally thick armour for its time, with frontal armour ranging between 75mm to 90mm, which made it nearly impervious to the anti-tank weapons used by Axis forces, including Italy's lighter armoured vehicles. Its turret and hull were heavily plated, with even the roofs and undersides armoured to about 40mm thickness. If you thought the British Matilda was a problem for the Italians in North Africa, it had nothing on the KV-1. The KV-1 having even more armour protection than the Matilda and better penetration thanks to the ballistics of its 76mm guns, and it could move quicker than the Matilda. The KV-1's combination of firepower, armour and adequate mobility made direct confrontations lethal for Italian armoured units, who often had to rely on infantry, artillery and air support to counter such formidable Soviet tanks. The Soviets also fielded the BT series of tanks, fast light tanks, and while they may not have been so much of a problem to penetrate and damage, their high speed could exploit gaps in enemy lines. Other light vehicles included the T-60 and later T-70 models, small, compact, and featured some armour sloping. There were also the BA series of armoured cars. Lighter vehicles were targeted by Italy's armour, but in the face of T-34s or KV-1s, Italy's lighter, less armoured vehicles had to use evasive manoeuvres. Soviet infantry was organised into large, well-supplied formations thanks to the Red Army's robust logistical infrastructure. Supply chains and reinforcements were efficiently managed, allowing continuous fighting even amidst high casualties. Soviet units benefited from superior artillery, rapid reserves deployment and stronger anti-tank weapons, systematically replenishing losses far faster than Italy or even Germany could match. The Red Army's logistical system enabled rapid movement and refuelling of mechanised units and keeping armour on the move for offensive operations. Tanks like the T-34 and KV-1 would have their mechanical problems, but the Soviets' logistics infrastructure was far better in getting tanks repaired and back in operation than the Italians on the Eastern Front. Coordination of infantry riding on tanks to maintain breakthrough momentum also helped offensive manoeuvres for the Soviets, improving combined arms deployments. And the Soviets were also able to provide consistent supplies of ammunition, food and new troops to the front lines. In contrast, Italian forces suffered persistent shortages in armour, ammunition and winter equipment. Their logistical infrastructure was not designed for prolonged high-intensity warfare, leaving them vulnerable during Soviet counter-offensives and encirclement operations. The problem for any nation trying to invade a country is that it will face fierce resistance from those defending it, and if that resistance is supported with a well-organised and armed military, backed up by decent logistical infrastructure, then there are going to be problems for the invading force. This was evident not only for the Italians, but also the other Axis forces on the Eastern Front, the Hungarians, the Romanians, and the Germans. The collapse of the Italian army in Russia on the Eastern Front was a catastrophic event that unfolded during the harsh winter of 1942 to 1943 and had far-reaching implications. The Armia was positioned along the Don River to protect the flanks of the German Sixth Army as it advanced towards Stalingrad. However, when the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn in December 1942, targeting the weaker Axis allies on the perimeter, the Italian Eighth Army bore the brunt of the assault. The Soviet offensive began with the 63rd Army attacking the Italian sectors held by the Ravenna and Coseria divisions, outnumbering them significantly by about 9-1. Despite fierce resistance lasting until December the 19th, the Italian forces were overwhelmed and forced into retreat. Trapped in a larger Soviet encirclement that included pockets around Stalingrad, the Italian troops faced brutal winter conditions, poor supply lines, and were inadequately equipped for the scale and intensity of the Soviet armoured and infantry assault. The Soviet attacks soon shattered the entire Axis front north of Stalingrad. Italian divisions, alongside Romanian and Hungarian units, suffered heavy casualties and disintegration as the Soviets advanced. The 2nd Alpini Division, Tridentina, part of the Amir, managed a breakout through the Soviet lines and retreated westward, reaching German defensive positions by the end of January 1943. The retreat was costly, with tens of thousands of Italian soldiers killed, wounded or captured. Official losses for the Amir were staggering. Over 114,000 out of approximately 235,000 deployed soldiers were killed, missing or captured, and many others were incapacitated by frostbite and exhaustion. Following the collapse, the remnants of the Italian forces were gradually repatriated to Italy by March 1943. The defeat was a severe blow to the morale of the Italian military and public alike, undermining confidence in Mussolini's regime and highlighting the inadequacies of Italy's military preparation and equipment. Italy's fate worsened in the months that followed. After the Allied invasion of Sicily in mid-1943, Italy faced internal collapse. Mussolini was deposed on July the 25th, 1943, and Italy signed an armistice with the Allied forces on September the 8th, 1943. The Italian military in the homeland retreated or switched allegiance depending on circumstances, but on the Eastern Front, the Amir was effectively eliminated, marking the end of Italy's military presence there. From late 1943 through early 1944, Italy was engulfed in turmoil. The German army occupied northern and central Italy, while the Allies advanced from the south. Italian forces loyal to the King and Badoglio retreated and reorganised, fighting alongside the Allies. The official evacuation of Italian personnel from the Eastern Front ended with all surviving Italian units withdrawn well before the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. The Eastern Front campaign reflects the harsh realities and immense sacrifices of Italy's involvement in the Eastern Theatre during World War II, highlighting the limits of its military capacity in a brutal and severe environment.